Hello and welcome to this Saturday's Patrons podcast and video. And since we this week have looked at Acts 14, where Paul and Barnabas go through what we might call Galatia. Of course, Galatia, as we'll see in a second, is more of a Roman nomenclature for this region. Let me go ahead and jump ahead to this. This is a figure that comes out of my New Testament survey book, which, by the way, you can get for a song used on Amazon. Let me give a shameless plug for my New Testament survey. My sense is that lay people and people studying for ministry, most of them really love my New Testament survey book. And I believe the price has come down to about $30 on Amazon, even new, because it's run its course in a way. And Indiana Wesleyan's not going to be doing more revisions of it, I don't think. But what I'm trying to get at is that I've found that students in the adult and professional studies program here at IWU and pastors in training generally really, I mean, I don't think they're just flattering me. I get really positive feedback on the textbook. And the reason I think is because it is really aimed at the church person. It's not aimed at the scholar. And let's just face it, scholars tend to require as textbooks books that they as scholars like. And so you have this gap. You have the professors requiring textbooks that are not necessarily as appealing to the people actually studying the New Testament. Okay, I'll stop there. Basically, I really don't think that there is another New Testament survey book that is better for lay people and the majority of pastors than my New Testament survey book. Of course, feel free to disagree in the comments. But anyway, so this is a graph. It's not a great graph, of course, and that's true. The graphics of the textbook book aren't as good as others, that's for sure. But anyway, I'm not Zondervan. But here is a graphic. This is Turkey, right? So Turkey's kind of a big nose sticking out of the Middle East, I guess you might say. And we call the place where Ephesus is Asia. And that's confusing because that's not what we call Asia today. But the western part of Turkey was called Asia, and it was very much Greek. I went on a tour in Ephesus once, and the tour guide basically was trying to say, don't let anybody convince you that this was Greek before it was Turkish. Surely he wasn't saying that, because that simply isn't debatable. This was a Roman Empire at the time of Christ, and the number one language spoken was Greek. And Turkish didn't even exist yet on this continent at that point. Anyway, not important, just clarifying history. So we can speak of Galatia in two parts. So the original Galatia, what we might call the ethnic Galatia, these were the people that went on. So they branched off, and these are the people that went on to be the Gauls in France, and they went on to be the Celts in Scotland and Ireland. So these are a traveling band of Gauls, the Galatians. Some of them settled here, and so this northern part, which would include Ankara, the capital of Turkey today. That's North Galatia when we refer to that. And that's historic Galatia. So classicists tend to think of that north part as being Galatia. However, at the time of Paul, the last king of Galatia was Amyntas, I believe, and he died in 25 BC and bequeathed this area here to the Romans. It may not have been in 25, but basically in the year 25 BC, this whole area, both the original North Galatia and now the South Roman Galatia, all this became Galatia at the time of Paul. Before Paul was born, this all became Galatia. So the debate is, when Paul wrote the Galatians, was he writing to North Galatia, which is probably what the older scholars used to think, influenced by the fact that they'd studied the classics. But most scholars now, I would say, see Galatians is written more to South Galatia. And in the end of this video, I'm going to say that makes sense, because these are the cities that and again, just speaking as a scholar, I think it is very reasonable to believe that Paul visited these cities. Now, you might be saying, well, of course he did. It's in the book of Acts, but you have to prove everything in the scholarly world. But basically, I'm saying, yeah, I think Paul did visit these cities. And yeah, this is South Galatia. And so, although at one point, actually the first edition of the textbook, the first edition of this New Testament survey, I was still leaning toward the North Galatia theory. But the second edition, I believe, I came to my senses and admitted that it's probably South Galatia that the book of Galatians is primarily written to. Okay, so that's the question and of this video to some extent. There's more to this video than just geography. So don't give up yet. There's more. Okay, so North and South Galatia. North Galatia is Ankara, north of the region mentioned in Acts. Paul may have gone through Ankara, because on his second missionary journey, he makes a beeline across Asia, Anatolia, we might call it then. It pains me to call it Turkey, although that's easiest to remember. Let's call it Anatolia. Paul makes his way across Anatolia diagonally of sorts on his second missionary journey. And it's quite possible that Paul went through Ankara on that. The book of Acts just doesn't tell us. Of course, the book of Acts doesn't tell us lots of stuff. As you probably picked up already, the book of Acts doesn't tell us everything. And we're going to see that especially when we turn to Acts 15 this coming week, Lord willing. So Ankara would be the North Galatian theory. This is the older, I'm repeating things I've already said, this was the older location of Galatia when the ethnic Galatians actually passed through the region. Now, at the time of Paul, there were people who spoke that Galatian tongue. But I would say it was probably getting more difficult to distinguish Galatians ethnically from the surrounding peoples. And so I think probably the majority hypothesis is the Galatians basically intermarried and disappeared. Some of them, of course, went on. Some of them went on west, to France, and then to be the Celts in Scotland and Ireland and Wales. Oh my. But some of them stayed and intermarried and kind of watered themselves down genetically by intermarriage. But in the classical age, there were Galatians, especially in the 1st century BC. So the Roman province was formed in 25 BC, included the south as well, and those are the cities where Acts mentions. Now, there is some inscriptional evidence that suggests that the southern Galatians also considered themselves Galatians. I'm getting this especially from the IVP dictionary of Paul and his letters, also now incorporated. The key articles from the IVP dictionary of Paul and his letters have been incorporated in the IVP dictionary of the New Testament. And the article either on Galatia or on Galatians, I forget which one, gives some evidence of inscriptions found in South Galatia, indicating that they considered themselves Galatians too at the time of Paul. In fact, I got the impression from that article that, and I forget who wrote it, but that they may have even kind of looked to the Galatians as a kind of hero. Oh, those heroes, the Galatians, that's us. In the same way that, I don't know, I'm a Pilgrim Holiness background. My parents were Pilgrim Holiness, but yet I have adopted the Wesleyan Methodist abolitionism, where in 1843, Orange Scott and Luther Lee left the Methodist Episcopal Church because they were taking a stand against slavery. That's not really my religious genealogy, because I'm a Pilgrim Holiness. I'm not a Wesleyan Methodist. Pilgrim Holiness was a revivalist movement in the early 20th century and a teeny bit in the late 1800s. So that's way after, but I've kind of adopted it. Yeah, we're abolitionists. We're Wesleyans. Go Wesleyans. Yay, rah. Gone on, Wesleyans. We are right for the fight tonight. No, that's not. Do we have a fight song? No, probably not. We have a, we're right for the peace tonight. Anyway, never mind. Okay, so it may be that the Southern Galatians kind of adopted that Galatian lore. We're the Galatians, even though they weren't genetically or biologically Galatians. Okay, North and South Galatia. There's the map. I've already shown it to you. And so now, arguments for the North Galatia. So why, Ken? Why did you used to go with the North Galatian theory? Well, it was the original Galatia. And I did not at that, I was not aware at that point of inscriptional evidence from South Galatia as part of it. And going with the classics. I mean, if you look at the, what is the Little Scott, that's a classic Greek dictionary. Bauer, Bauer, Arndt, Gingrich, Denker is the classic New Testament Greek dictionary. And I believe, if I remember correctly, it even defines Galatia in terms of North Galatia. Why? Because the people who put that together were classically trained. So the North Galatia was the original Galatia. And here's, again, my theory was that Paul might have passed through North Galatia on his way through Anatolia. He didn't know he was headed for Greece at the time, but we know now he was headed for Greece, that God was leading him toward Greece, according to Acts. And he probably would have passed through North Galatia, or might have, on his way toward Greece. Although it seems to me I also remember perhaps some people questioning whether the road went quite that way. Now that I'm thinking of it. Well, here's one of the arguments that I used. This was one of the strong arguments I used for the North Galatian theory, and it's from Galatians chapter 4. And to be honest, it is difficult to fit this statement from Paul with the way the book of Acts presents Paul's first missionary journey. Here, let me quote it. You can read it, of course, but you know it was because of a sickness of the flesh that I preached the good news to you the first time. And you did not despise or loathe your testing because of my flesh. You had to take care of me. But you received me as a messenger of God, even as Christ Jesus. Therefore, where's your blessing? What's happened? You were so kind to me. But you, at that point, I witnessed that, if possible, you would have given me your own eyes, having plucked them out. There are a number of things that seem obvious to me from this quote. They do not seem obvious to others. But to me, this is pretty straightforward. Paul is basically saying that whoever he wrote Galatians to, he first preached to them because he had an illness and they had to take care of him. So this raises the question, how could an illness have planted Paul in Galatia? So this fit the North Galatian theory just fine, that Paul would have been on his way across Anatolia. He gets to that middle region and he gets struck with an illness that maybe some have suggested malaria, or something like that. And suddenly he finds that he can't go on. He has to stop. He needs help. He needs support. And of course, if Barnabas is with him, why wouldn't Barnabas take care of him? Of course, you could say the same of Silas on his second missionary journey. But Paul's on his way and he stops because he's sick. That seems a very natural way to read this. By the way, the word first time, this word first time most naturally reads, it's thin line, but it most naturally suggests that Paul has already been to this region more than once by the time he writes Galatians. And of course, that is the way I date Galatians. I date the book of Galatians to Paul's time at Ephesus on his third missionary journey. It's very, very, very popular in evangelical circles to say that Galatians was the first of Paul's letters. And actually, my intention next week is to talk about the Jerusalem Council in relation to Galatians 2. So next week, Lord willing, will be on Galatians as well. But it seems to me that this word suggests that Paul's been there more than once. And if Galatians were his first letter, he would have only been there once by the time he wrote Galatians. The reason why the Galatians' earliest letter is very popular is because it suggests that the issues of Galatians 2 and Acts 15 were resolved in the year 49, and then the church was pretty much in agreement after that. I'm going to argue next week that it's more likely that those issues were not completely resolved by the time Paul left on his second missionary journey, and that in fact there would remain tremors of disagreement on those issues for years to come. That in other words, that the solution of the Jew-Gentile problem was more long and drawn out than you might think. And so the early date for Galatians, a lot of times the book of Galatians might be dated before the Jerusalem Council, before Acts 15, and then you can say, Acts 15 took care of everything, and then they were all singing Kumbaya again. Well, that's a week from now. So it seems to me this suggests that Paul was not intending to stop in Galatia, but because of sickness, he had to stop. And again, the train of thought here seems, it's so obvious to me that it seems to be eye trouble that is the main culprit here. I said malaria. Malaria can cause eye damage, but and of course, the old traditional interpretation of the thorn in the flesh is that Paul's thorn in the flesh was continued eye trouble. That's the traditional. That's what I grew up hearing in college and in seminary. So there's a lot of attempt to explain that away. I don't know why, but it just seems pretty obvious here. Just listening to the text, you would have given me your own eyes, but you didn't despise, the testing you had because of my flesh, because of my body. Again, I don't think it's because he had a spiritual problem or a temptation. This is talking about a physical sickness that he had, and he mentions his eyes. So you can't travel. You have to stop traveling unless somebody's going to help you when you suddenly have eye trouble. So the North Galatian theory explained very nicely why Paul might be on his way somewhere and have to stop because he's having an illness that involves eye trouble. So why South Galatia? Well, to me, the reason why I finally gave in is because we have evidence that Paul was in South Galatia. He was in Antioch. He was in Iconium. He was in Lystra. He was in Derbe. We know this. And so it just seems like that's probably where he would write. It's not that Ankara isn't possible. It just doesn't seem as likely. Here is this question, though. It leaves this big question. How could Paul have ended up in this area because of an illness? So Paul was down in Cyprus, right? He was down in the island of Cyprus, and then they went north to Galatia. This is not on their way anywhere in terms of the church. The church is over in Jerusalem and Antioch of Syria. And so Paul and Barnabas go north. That requires intentionality. You don't go north on your way back to Antioch. And of course, Acts doesn't tell us any of this. So this leads me to think that there's a whole lot of the story that Acts isn't telling us. Where I wish we had a Mark volume 2 or a Matthew volume 2 or a Paul, more from Paul, because it seems like there must be a bunch of missing pieces, or at least some key missing pieces from what Acts tells us here. So how would Paul have ended up? I mean, was there a special doctor in Turkey that he was going to see? I mean, I don't know. I mean, we just don't know. However, here's a possibility. So if Antioch of Pisidia is up here, Tarsus is down here. So it is conceivable that Paul could have been on his way from Antioch to Tarsus, and that he hit eye problems at Lystra and Derbe. So if Lystra and Derbe are the primary cities to which Galatians is addressed, and of course Lystra is where Timothy's from, so it's possible. Let's say that Antioch of Pisidia doesn't actually is not actually the centerpiece of the Galatian churches. What if Lystra and Derbe are the centerpieces of the Galatian churches. Then you could say that Paul might have been on his way from Antioch down to Tarsus when he hit the eye trouble, and he had to stop in Lystra for a time because he was having trouble. And so that might explain it. And then that might explain why then he, after staying some time in Lystra and Derbe, he ends up going back and retracing his steps. Maybe he wasn't intending to do that, but since he got stopped here and was here for a while, recovering from whatever eye trouble he was having, maybe then he said, well, we've been here a while, let's go back to Antioch and all the other churches. So that's possible. It's possible that, and maybe that makes the most sense of all the hypotheses. Although I was reading Craig Keener, and this was another thought that came up. There is at least some evidence that the family of Sergius Paulus came from the center, a little bit south of Ankara in Anatolia. And so if he had a really good relation with Sergius Paulus in Cyprus, maybe Sergius says, why don't you go up and visit my family? Or why don't you go preach the gospel to my family? I've told them you're coming. So that Paul would have been headed north to visit Sergius Paulus' family when he got sick around Antioch and had to spend extra time there recovering. So that would be another hypothesis. We really don't know. And it highlights the fact that we really aren't getting everything in Acts. We are only getting a part of the puzzle in the book of Acts. So I hope it'd be great if we dug up some manuscript someday that filled in some of these blanks. Well, this is a little bit longer video. I hope you haven't minded. But we've been talking about who are the Galatians.